This week our topic was measuring STEM through CTE. In other words, how can we measure STEM concepts as taught through career and technical education? And admittedly, there were 3 very dense readings this week. The first reading that you had, Integration from K-12 Education, that's Chapter 3 at the National Research Council on the STEM Integration booklet. And then these last 2 were journal articles related to STEM course preparation for non-college bound, which again gets at the audience that we primarily work with, career and technical ed. At least we like to think that we have the ability to prepare those going right to work, right to a career, or going for some post-secondary, or going to college. So this had direct implications for career and technical education, admittedly a bit dense. And then this last article, STEM Pathways, examining persistence in rigorous math and science courses taking. Now the question I asked you this week was, hold this over, about 3 takeaway messages, and select one item from each reading you can use to advocate or suggest a reform in CTE. So hopefully what my goal here was to have you read these articles, and just like many of you have taken in the Reading and Applying Research course, be able to take what research is telling you and formulate or frame a way that there are implications for you in the classroom, some things that you might change, or as you become a leader in your district, that you might be able to bring some knowledge to for making some changes or some improvements with career and technical education related to STEM. And the second question was a reflection question on your current assessment methods, and what, if anything, you see yourself changing in terms of practice in the future. And for those of you who had the evaluation assessment class, this may have been a little bit easier, but gave you a couple of videos from Rick Wormelli to help you get a little bit into the topic in case this was new to you. So let's start then with the first question, really looking at the 3 articles for takeaways. And I've opened them up, and as I mentioned, they are fairly dense. I actually looked at ways to possibly move one to a different week, but that meant moving some other one that was there that went with that topic. And so, believe it or not, there were 2 others that I did cut. But these I thought got really at the nuts and bolts about looking at that CTE STEM integration and really how we would measure our impact in that area. Many of you cited as a takeaway from this article identity. You talked about that being something you hadn't really considered. You've always talked about aptitude or even skills through academic achievement as being an indicator, or just somebody's interest. But many of you commented on identity and that you hadn't really thought about that, and that resonated with you. Others of you talked about the aptitude and asked about, have you taken the ASVAB test? I think it was Lois that mentioned that. Yes, I have. I would have been a great helicopter mechanic, I guess, but the truth is I do have mechanical aptitude. I felt like that was actually a pretty good test, even though in the late 70s, probably wasn't going to go into the Army. There were some other issues around that. But others of you talked about mathematics, and after you, I think mostly because you've done the other readings, and also in this particular reading, it did talk about math and math integration and understanding math. And so I would call this kind of our big math week, if you will, especially as we look through the different studies. Okay, so that's Article 1. Lots of great posts. This one was a pretty easy read. Again, we've read other chapters out of this report this semester. I think Chapter 5 and Chapter 1, maybe even Chapter 2. But this was Chapter 3. All right, second reading. Do high school STEM courses prepare non-college bound youth for jobs in the STEM economy? Now this article, I always like to find the articles that do not confirm what I think might be going on. I think that is a good practice for critical thinking, that we're not always looking for things that confirm our own personal beliefs, but really going out there and Googling things on Google Scholar, like, articles STEM and CTE, which is how I found this one. STEM economy would have brought this one up, but really looking for those that really twist our minds and take us out, sometimes out of our comfort zone, and present research in a way that may not confirm what we really do think about is going on. And one thing that Kevin mentioned from this article is that, first off, I find the findings of this study seem to be contrary to what one might think. Yep. Non-college bound youth who took IT courses in high school were less likely to find employment in STEM economy than their peers that did not take IT courses. Yes. Wages were lowest for those who had earned STEM credits in high school, and the highest for those who had earned STEM credits in high school. Yes. And STEM economy appears to be largely unrelated with STEM course taking in high school. Yes. This is all what was found in this particular article. And like most research articles, there's an introduction, a background, they'll give you a literature review. But I'm going to skip right down here to the methods, because actually, oftentimes when somebody asks me to look at an article, I go right to the conclusions, I go right to the discussion to see, well, after I read the abstract, what's this about, to see what they found out. And then I want to know, well, they found that out, well, how did they get that data? And that is actually why the methods section is so critically important for you to take a look at with a critical eye. And in this case, they took research from the National Center for Educational Statistics, which is a big clearinghouse, collects all kind of data about the educational system in the United States, test scores, on and on and on. Cover this in reading and applying research. But they have a pretty good population, and they actually triangulated this data, so they have a pretty good sample size. So they talk about the study sample, they talk about the outcome measures that they were looking at, in other words, the dependent variable that they were looking at. They talk about the academies for STEM course taking, and I think a lot of you are aware of these STEM schools or STEM charter schools, and I think that this study was really it's taking a look at those kinds of schools. If we scroll up here, let's see, what was the year on this particular study is 2017, so it's very recent, but some of the data they're citing, because data is always a little bit behind, is a little bit older. So keep that in mind whenever you're reading researches. What year was it actually published, and what year were they collecting the data? Because in some instances, things can really change. You'll also see the research questions here. I don't want to belabor all of this, but I do want to jump down to the conclusions down here at the bottom. It has some more great statistics. The results. I want to go right down here to the result on CTE. I'm going to get there. Here we go. Our findings add some clarification patterns detected by previous studies, which found that advanced math course taking in high schools associated with higher wages in adulthood. Okay, that's where a lot of you started talking about math and why it was sort of important, and that was an important outcome for this study. Skipping down here though, past studies also found a positive relationship between CTE courses and the impact of technical skills. And they cite e.g. computer science, IT, and those kinds of things, and wages. This association was not evident in our study. Among our samples, students graduating from high school in 2004 having taken applied STEM courses was unrelated with wage within the first 2 years after taking high school. This null finding was particularly surprising given that there are increased demand for technical skills in the labor market, and given that CTE courses have evolved over the past decade so as to teach more advanced skills and training that are intended to directly convey to the workforce. Even if they are better equipped today's youth, for their tasks and responsibilities required in today's skill economy, our study shows that these courses aren't necessarily rewarded by employers. So what is this saying? Jean added on to this conversation and said, perhaps students need an extra post-secondary STEM training. Maybe they are not mature enough to handle the career coming straight out of high school. And maybe that means that employers are looking for some additional skills beyond maybe experiences, and maybe, quite honestly, there are enough college graduates that they are being outcompeted. There's so many other questions that can be asked from that particular point. So that was some of the main takeaways from Article 2. And again, it was a fairly dense reading, but hopefully the vocabulary was familiar enough to you, if not the statistics. I think that they did a good job summing up in their conclusion statements and also in their methodology. The third article was on STEM pathways taking persistence in rigorous math and science course taking. And this was the Florida study that many of you commented about in terms of the educational plan, the EPEP, which is essentially the Electronic Personal Education Planner. Again, this is a fairly dense article for reading, and it had a lot of descriptive statistics as well as inferential statistics throughout. But they did a really good job of looking at these STEM career academies, and in many states we have STEM schools here, we have STEM charter schools. They were really looking at participation in these STEM career academies as making a difference. And arguably, we would hope that in CTE, the way that we frame these courses, we make our courses very STEM-like, that we would have greater outcomes and have students going into more STEM pathways or STEM careers. So, talks about the data sources that they use. It tells you this was a longitudinal study, and that's kind of important because it's just not a one-off. It is not just done in 1 year, but that they followed these students, I believe it was over 4 years, taking a look at them as they created their EPP PEPs in 8th grade and during the 2009 through 2010 school year. And then finally, summing up with the data in 2000 and, it's in here somewhere, I believe 2014 or 2015. So some of you talked about the takeaways from this as in terms of what was right down here into the end of the discussion. And I'm going to scroll, as I mentioned before. Oftentimes I go to what their findings are, and then I go back to the methodologies, and then I take a closer look at the results, which is kind of, it's not posted that way, but I tend to look at research that way when I'm trying to scan through it. All right, in this discussion, it builds upon the limited knowledge about the impact of student participation in STEM career academies and their persistence in rigorous math and science course taking, and compares it to the rigorous STEM course taking patterns of Florida and national high school students. It sheds light on the outcome strategies used in Florida, and what they're using there are these EPEPs, which are these educational plans for career themed curricula programs. We have something similar in the state of Utah called the Student Education Occupational Plan or Career Planning Guides that are worked on in middle school, 7th grade in particular, and then courses are aligned with course goals, and as students set up the courses they're going to take, counselors and parents are supposed to help them with making those decisions. And of course, depending on how well they do in math, it can actually track them one way or another depending on what their career goals might be. So this was looking at that EPEP. A couple of interesting comments here. Who was it? Again, I think it might have been Kevin. He said, I really didn't understand in this article where they got the information. I couldn't figure out who was in charge of helping the students develop these plans, and were all people involved trained on developing the plans? Well, Kevin, that is a very good question. That's critically thinking about how did students report, how did they get this data reported back to them? Not how did they just collect it? I already told you they had good collection means, but how valid is the data? And that's essentially the question you're asking. So I Googled that, and this is Florida School Counselors Association, and this was posted in 2009. So this goes back right to the beginning when they were kicking off this study. Incoming high school freshmen are more prepared than ever for post-secondary education on career, thanks in part to the state's career and education planning courses taken in middle school. The state-required course taken in either 7th or 8th grade helps students explore their interests and research careers. Interesting. I'd sort of like to see that course, because it's my understanding that most states don't have one like Utah's. It's a year long. Maybe this is a short intervention. I'm not really sure. I'm not even sure if it's still going on, but once students choose a career goal and learn what level of education they need to achieve it, they create an electronic personal education plan, EPEP, as we've looked at, through Florida's online student advising system at facts.org. The EP is flexible and can easily be modified as the student's interests and goals may change. It also has other tools allowing the students to look for post-secondary institutions and so forth. So I decided to take a look at the website, because that article made it sound to me like students did this on their own with little or no guidance unless they asked for it from parents, and certainly it's not part of counselors. So it's a valid question, because when you go to this website, by the way, there's 3 ways to take a look at it: going to college, succeed in college, and find a career. But you're already forcing students into one pigeonhole rather than take a career and then figure out college, no college. So I find it interesting how they, right at the get-go, categorize these things. But I was able to find this plan form by going here and then dropping down, select your category, and didn't go through the entire thing, got to register and log in. But to answer your question, it's students doing this on their own with questionable guidance about how to go through and do some sort of a assessment of themselves, whether it be their own identity or their aspirations or their abilities in any way, shape, or form. So those are the good kinds of questions that you need to ask about research. It's important that when we're looking at these articles, we say, well, it answered those questions sort of, but oftentimes it raises even more questions. There was a post in here actually related to all the articles, and it was a response that Jean gave to Kate. I agree that asking students to choose lifelong careers in elementary or middle school is just not possible. Oh, this is the conversation about, we've had this before, about when should we choose, when should students start to decide, is it even smart for us to even introduce these kinds of concepts, that educational plan or SEOP, is it something that's really worth our time? So many people change their careers throughout their lives. And you know what? It's getting even faster. And so it seems like you need a really varied skill set, including the 21st century learning skills along with the academic skills. He says, I think the U.S. has made open career choices much a higher priority than providing students with a determined pathway. I wonder if this was intended or just a consequence of other policies. Probably the latter. Americans don't like to feel that they are being pigeonholed into anything, and they like the ability to think, this is America, we can do anything. If we want to go to the moon, if I want to be president of the United States, I want to be a dentist, I can do those kinds of things. So parents want to allow their children to dream. That is part of being American. However, sometimes they get way out there. I think we've mentioned this before. You know, if all the students say they're going to be a professional athlete, and less than 0.01% of our population becomes a professional athlete, and parents and others are encouraging them to continue down this path, that may not be a good idea. So somewhere there's some balance. He continues and says, should there be a multi-tiered education plans based on aptitude tests, or should we have a relatively consistent education plan for all and let them choose? So this gets into the idea of, should we move them in one way or another? And I don't know how many of you, I'm thinking a lot of you get the Techniques article or Techniques magazine put out by ACTE. This is the March issues. In fact, this year, I've had some of their articles featured in some of your readings as I thought they were appropriate. I didn't want to, sometimes I have to get you into the literature in terms of the research and the actual findings, and most of these would be kind of secondary sources and story-based or narratives. But occasionally you've had these. In fact, in January, there was one called Shaping Career Choices, Career Exploration and the Soft Skills. I think we read actually one of those articles. Navigating School to Work Transition, the Art of Counseling. So if you aren't a member of ACTE, you get this every month, and that had, as you can tell by my little tabs, I thought there were a lot of good articles in that one. We also, in November, December, got Women in CTE, and while I didn't choose one of these for when we were talking about marginalized folks, because we have so many other readings, and because I think many of you are getting this and can peruse this also had some really interesting articles. But the one I want to share from you came from March this year, International CTE, as CTE celebrates its 100th anniversary through the Smith-Hughes Act. So if we look here at the, there's a chapter here on, there's an article here on Switzerland's apprenticeship system, a source of inspiration. What I find really intriguing about this is, some of you said, so what should be done? You know, should we track students? Should we check their aptitude? Well, this is a really interesting system, but basically at age of 15 or 16, they've finished their compulsory education, and they can choose from roughly 230 different occupations, ranging from mechanical engineering to healthcare, from banking to IT. And it goes on to talk about the federal legislation. Let's keep in mind that it's somewhat a socialistic government, so it's different than the type of capitalism and the dare to dream kinds of things that we might find culturally here in the United States. But what's really intriguing about this is apprentices are typically spend 3 to 4 days a week in their company, where they participate in actual workflows assisted by their mentor. 1 or 2 days a week are spent in a vocational school where they learn occupational-related theoretical skills, but also general subjects that support their lifelong learning abilities. Now, I'm not going to go on and read that anymore, but I think I will see if I can snag at least just that article and post it under this reflection. But what I found interesting about this is that in our apprenticeships, we focus it very narrowly. You have an apprenticeship in mechanical engineering. In their case, might be everything from plumbing to designing maybe a container for a portable data logger or a cell phone. Whereas here, if we're talking about something like plumbing, we are just going to have that one thing, apprenticeship in plumbing. And so they have this exploration in the entire area that would be kind of in agriculture. It might be everybody from those working, if it's an animal science, those working in the stalls or barns with horses or cattle or whatever, all the way up to the genetic engineering part of genetics for that particular breed, whether it be cattle or horses or whatever it is. They put an apprenticeship that takes the entire career cluster, not just one pathway. And so I found that really interesting. They have a lot of time, they make a lot of connections, and they decide at that point, yes or no, I do need more education. So that was pretty much it on the articles. And then on the second question, there was a lot of really good reflection about what you can do in your own teaching, how things you have learned have informed your teaching, how the assessment practices that have been discussed. And many of you talked about formative assessments as being really important and trying to find ways to bring more of that into your instruction. Keep this in mind. The key difference here: the formative assessment and summative assessment. Summative is graded, and actually both types of assessment should inform our teaching. But students need to know that you're in this together. That your assessment is informing your teaching so you can do a better job. And that assessment is hopefully measuring their achievement at understanding those outcomes or objectives of what you have lined out for that particular course. I think sometimes assessment is adversarial. Teacher-student is an adversarial relationship in assessment. And there needs to be something conveyed with you and the students that, like, you are helping me to make better instruction so you'll get this content. Hopefully that's discussed more in your assessment class with competency-based instruction and so forth. A couple of other thoughts. Some of you talked about the cool factor and how you were going to elevate CTE and how it's perceived or what its perception is in the school, and linking it to STEM. I think it was maybe Lois or somebody, it was Corey, who talked about that he sets up a showcase to showcase the works being done, and it looks very STEM-like. And Lois commented, yes, that's really important, and that the cool factor is really important. I want to drive that home. And using those spaces that you have in your school, you don't want to put up something cheesy or hokey. You want to put up something that's cool. And if you don't know if it's cool, ask the age group that you're trying to deal with what would be cool, or have them help you develop it so that others walk by and don't see it as cheesy. And also it might even be less work for you if you involve them. So presenter showcase is a great idea. Make sure that it really engages students in the content area that you're trying to showcase. And Amelia stated that even when she does things like has a guest speaker or something come in, make sure you're bringing speakers that are really, encourage them to bring hands-on things or pictures or movie that really show cool things. In her case, a robotic cow milking system. One last request, do the evaluation. I see that only 3 of the 11 of you have completed it so far. I'm hoping for 100%, professional to professional. Your comments do help shape or inform. It's formative feedback for me for making changes next time. And so it's anonymous. It doesn't affect anyone's grade, mine or yours. So I really appreciate it if you would submit your comments about ways that I could improve this course, ways that would connect better with you, ways that it would be more meaningful to you in any way, shape, or form. And that will help me next time I go to teach STEM and CTE.